All right. Once more, I welcome all of you to the class, to the office hour. Feel free to just make this a question and answer session. And so I will answer your questions if you have concerns. One of the concerns by a few students has been when is the paper due and what should it entail? A formal announcement will be made this time next week about the final project. So let's not talk about it now. I will make a formal announcement, say on Thursday next week or no later than the weekend of July 3 or July 2. So we'll get into that detail. For today, I'm going to begin the first installment, or I will say the first discussion of one of the reasons that the opium and cocaine trade have gone on for decades. And I'm going to look at the economic aspects, the economic history of opium from the 19th century. I mean, the trade in opium has been going on for centuries, and even as far back as the 17th century. We talk about active state-related trade in opium. But the intensity of the trade that brings to fore, that makes very, very clear that the background to the difficulty of the war on drugs, especially opium and cocaine, has been the economic profitability of those two commodities and other commodities of illicit trade, has been the economic value to a few, I will say, profit-making groups or individuals or companies or even countries from trading opium. So I'm going to begin with opium. We're going to get into cocaine next week. So in modern times, the persistence of the trade in opium and cocaine can be explained largely by economic gains. So we're going to focus on the 18th, the 19th, and the 20th centuries, but especially the 19th and the 20th centuries. Now, let me begin with the broad outline of the explanation. Specifically, in the 19th century, for example, in the 1800s, the key production centers for raw opium in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and they were in China, in India, and the Eastern Mediterranean, especially in Afghanistan. But also in some colonies in Persia. Now, what happened was that, I mean, the Chinese people did grow a little bit of opium, and their people did use opium, but it was something that was really limited and expensive, and entirely, much of the opium was for domestic consumption, and very little of it. But what happened was that in the early part of the 19th century, the worldwide demand for opium began to grow tremendously. And in fact, the Dutch invested in state-of-the-art processing facilities for opium. And so the British, because even the British produced a little bit of opium in England. But the key thing that happened that makes a big history in opium is that, for example, the Dutch, from say, if you look at the statistics from 1914 into 1940s, for example, the Dutch government derived a lot of revenue. And in fact, at some point in the early 20th century, the Dutch government derived about 13% of its revenue from taxation of opium, okay? And of course, that percentage declined as other economic commodities began to get into the economy. However, on the British side, what really happened was that the British were buying tea from India, okay? They bought tea from India, and the Indians, insisted that the tea must be paid for in gold, okay? The British began to run a trade deficit against India, and so given the increased demand and the extensive demand for opium around the world, the Chinese began to also consume a lot of opium. And so what happened was that the British would buy opium from Afghanistan. I remember we talked about the areas where this opium was grown and where it really thrives. And Afghanistan is one of the places, or you can say the Eastern Mediterranean areas, but principally in Afghanistan. And so they would buy the opium from Afghanistan, and it was the East Indian Trading Company that was really making the huge profits out of this. And of course, they would buy it cheaply from Afghanistan, and then they would sell it to the Chinese. And given now that, they would buy it cheaply, and so that there was now, huge production of opium, they would sell it to the Chinese, and the Chinese paid them in gold. And then they will use the gold to pay for tea in India. Okay, so you can see the economic benefits. And so, and those that benefited a lot from this were a group of people called the Parsis of India, who, of course, were either middlemen or some kind of traders in opium. The Parsis of India actually are Persians. This is, probably, don't quote me on that. Probably is, calling them Parsis was probably a derogatory way, or just a way of, giving them some kind of a nickname. But they were Persians who migrated to India, and they were of a particular religious inclination, religious belief. And so maybe they were persecuted in their homeland in Iran, because, Iran is what you really call Persia, okay? The ancient Persian kingdom or empire that you probably read about in the Bible. Now, if you read the Bible, or if you just read history, you talk about a group of people called the Persians. Actually, it's in present-day Iran. Okay, now these people are very, very, I would say, competent merchants, and so they profited tremendously from selling opium in China. But of course, they were in cahoots with the British. Now, just to make some points very, very clearly, I'll give you some of the issues that came up at that time. It just happened then that importing or selling this opium to the Chinese people began to really, create a lot of problems for the Chinese, and it created, two economic problems. The first one was that, the Chinese began to run a tremendous, trade deficit against the British. So much so that by 1837, opium became about 57% of Chinese imports. And then the Chinese that used to have quite a bit of gold surplus in their international trading system began to run a lot of deficit. And so the Chinese government became worried for two good reasons. First of all, they began to deplete their treasury of a lot of gold. And again, the male population, was essentially being weakened, which of course would weaken the state, because the Chinese official argued that if the trend continues, it will not take a long time for them not only not to have males who would serve in the army, because the males are now being essentially weakened by opium. But of course, you know, when people take things like opium, then they cannot concentrate. I mean, behaviorally, and this is what the Chinese government probably meant. They wouldn't have men to be able to join an army, but worse, they wouldn't even have money to pay an army, even if they wanted to go to war. And so what happened then was that the Chinese government now decreed that no opium should be imported into China. And the British, of course, went through corrupt officials in China to find ways to circumvent the prohibition to import opium into China. And so what happened then was that the Emperor of China sent emissaries, sent their representatives in the city of Canton, China. Canton is right on the coast of China, on the eastern coast of China, the southeastern coast, I think, if my geography is correct. And they began to seize and confiscate ships that tried to circumvent the blockade of opium ships. Now, what happened then was the British accused the Chinese or complained. Let me put it this way: it was not accused; they actually, complained that the Chinese were obstructing trade. And of course, the whole idea is that there should be free trade. Okay. Now, I guess the British, it did not matter what the trade was about. Trade is trade. So they felt like the Chinese people were trying to obstruct trade, trying to prevent them from trading. And so the Chinese officials actually confiscated huge quantities of opium that was being imported into China and actually burned them. Now, what happened then was that the British ordered a blockade of one of the main rivers through which ships come out of China or go into China for trade. And so it just happened that as a result of the dispute, in March 1839, the British declared a war on China. And so the war continued until about 1841. Okay, and in 1842, a treaty was signed between the Chinese and the British. Of course, the British had more technology, a much more highly organized army, and they compelled the Chinese to make concessions. And that was when China conceded the island of Hong Kong to Great Britain. In a treaty, and I think it was a 150-year treaty. And then the treaty also compelled the Chinese to open certain ports, about 5 ports, Canton and Shanghai, and 3 other ports to free trade, so that the British could trade freely. Now, of course, the Chinese were compelled to abolish trading monopolies. Now, the question then, I mean, I don't know what trading monopolies, the Chinese had, but it was not, it does not, I don't have to be specific. The point being that the Chinese were compelled to, concede certain of their islands that facilitated trade to the British, and also allowed trade to continue. Now, the other thing was that the Chinese were also compelled to pay reparations in money to British merchants for the opiums that had been confiscated and destroyed by the Chinese government. Now, besides the British, the United States and France also extracted concessions from the Chinese in 1842 over this treaty, over this trade issue about opium. That was the Treaty of Nanking, Nanking. Nanking. Nanking is a Chinese word. It's not the king there is not English. It's a Chinese pronunciation. And so it was called the Treaty of Nanking. And so they continued. And so, of course, the squabble did not end there. The Chinese made the concessions, but still, they continued to find ways to obstruct the importation of opium in their country. And so the squabble continued, and the Chinese were not willing to concede or to implement all the aspects of the treaty. And so what happened then was that in 1856, again, the British kind of precipitated another war. And so there were two opium wars, one that began in 1839 and ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking. And then the British, the Chinese, were not willing to implement all the aspects of the treaty. And so in 1856, let me say, another conflict, another war, another confrontation, military confrontation was precipitated. And so the British, again, succeeded in destroying, ports in China, in sacking some cities in China, and even destroyed the emperor's palace somewhere in China. And so in 1860, the second treaty was signed. And the Chinese also had to pay more reparations to British merchants. Besides that, the British were permitted. Now think about this, and maybe you can, conjecture, I would say, extrapolate from that some of the history of the United States here. The Chinese were forced to concede another, a couple of other ports, including a port called Kowloon, to Great Britain, and agreed to permit the export of indentured servants to the United States, indentured laborers. What do you think an indentured laborers are? Can somebody tell me what an indentured laborer is? Hello, Mr. Oscar. What's an indentured laborer?
My bad, I didn't hear you. Say it again. Sorry. I'm driving and listening at the same time.
Okay, maybe I shouldn't distract you since you are driving. Mr. Logan, what is an indentured laborer? Now, one of the concessions that the Chinese made after the Second Opium War was to agree to the export of indentured Chinese laborers to the Americas. What is an indentured laborer? Mr. Logan.
Yeah, I'm not too sure. You said intention letter?
No, I said, what is an indentured? Indenture. An indentured laborer. Know what a laborer is?
No, I don't.
You don't know what a laborer is?
Laborer, no.
Laborer, somebody that labors.
No.
Right? Have you ever heard the word a laborer here in the United States?
No, I haven't.
Okay, what is an indentured servant?
Indenture servant.
Indenture, yes, an indentured servant. Karen Mosley, do you know what
someone who is working without pay?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, indentured laborers. Now, one of the concessions that the Chinese had to make after they lost the Second Opium War was to permit the export of Chinese indentured laborers, indentured servants to the United States or to the Americas. Okay? And see, it enabled the infusion of the injection of massive quantities of cheap labor for the construction of transcontinental railways in the United States and Canada. What does that remind you of? What does it remind you of? The Chinese were forced to permit the massive exportation of indentured servants to the Americas that infuse large quantities or large numbers of cheap labor that help for the construction of the transcontinental railways in USA and Canada. What does it remind you of?
I would say like something like American slavery.
Yes. Now, the difference between a chattel slave and an indenture. Indenture means somebody that owes. Okay. So it's somebody that owes. Now, an indentured servant can work for a certain number of years with very cheap, very low pay, and maybe after 10 years, they are free. Okay. Now, when you think about the American colonies, before they began to import African slaves in the first quarter of the 1600s, they had prisoners and people who owed money in England that came to America as indentured servants. Indenture meaning this is somebody that owes money. This is somebody that owes labor. And when they work for 10 years, 7 years, 12 years, it depends on how long the indenture is, then they are free. And so what does it explain? How does it explain to you why you have large numbers of Chinese people in the West Coast? Or does it explain it to you? Hello? Somebody give me an answer. Mostly Logan, Oscar. You can argue. Somebody can argue that
Maybe
yes.
because that's where they do cheap labor. That's where they were imported to do cheap labor.
Yes. As part of this war, as part of the conclusion of this war, the Chinese were forced to permit large numbers of their population as cheap labor, like semi-slaves, to the West Coast of America. You know, somebody coming from China, of course, is going to end up in the West Coast. That would be the cheapest way to get them to the Americas at that time. Because the alternative would be to transport them through India and through Africa and you know, through the southern coast of Africa and then into the West Indies. But it's much easier to get them through the Pacific and into places like San Francisco or the West Coast of the United States, Los Angeles and what have you. And this probably explains why you have large numbers of those Chinese people in those areas who helped to construct the railway. So in a sense, this was a second phase of American slavery, or even a third phase of American slavery, because the indentured servitude that of Europeans coming into America in the 16th century, in the 1500s and the 1600s, of course, eventually, you're dealing with Europeans. And so even though somebody comes as an indentured servant from England, from France, from Germany, and from Spain, and what have you, once they work their way out of their indenture, which, you know, would be maybe 7 years or 8 years or 5 years or 3 years, depending on the agreement, what would happen? They would simply integrate into the society, and you wouldn't know in the next 5, 10 years whether this person was a slave or was not. And meanwhile, they could not withstand the labor, the intensity of the labor, especially in the West Indies, where the sun is very hot. And so they decided to import Africans. Okay, so you can say the first phase of slavery was when Europeans were the enslaved ones, when the Native Americans were the enslaved ones, and then the African slave trade became the second phase. Now this was more like the third phase, because not only Chinese were imported, but Indians also, you know, betrayed their own people, who ended up in South America. It's in the Caribbean area of South America, like Trinidad, what do you call that place? Guyana, the Guyanas, you know, and where else? Brazil. Well, Brazil is mostly Africans. And you know, the Eastern Caribbean, you see, you know, quite a bit of Indians there. So in any event, this was one of the concessions that the Chinese had to make, which was to allow large members of the population to be exported to the Americas. And so, but again, the whole idea is that there was a lot of economic gain in the sale of opium. You know, and what you need to understand then is that the war on drugs is not something that is recent. Okay, the war against drugs or against opium, you know, today we're talking about opium. It's not something that began today. What you should understand is that the communities, you know, or the leaders, the political leaders, social leaders of many communities throughout, you know, at least the last 500 years, have seen that opium is not something that is good for their communities, and so they resist. Okay, and so they say what goes around comes around. So today, who is fighting against drugs? Who is fighting against opium and cocaine as something that really, you know, creates, I would say, disturbances or disequilibriums in their society? It's the Americans and the Western Europeans who are now fighting against these drugs. Okay, but the Chinese did fight against it. The Europeans also did fight against it way back then. But you can see when the Chinese fought against it, when the Indians fought against it, somebody said, no, you are really, you know, obstructing trade, and we must continue to sell it to you. And the same way today, you can see Americans say we don't want it, and the Mexicans, South Americans are saying, no, you're going to have it. Okay, the methods are somewhat similar, the methods are somewhat different. The instruments are similar, the instruments are somewhat different. So I need for you to read the articles here, and if you want me to specify, there are 3 articles that are very critical to understanding this economic aspect. One of them is called Opium Wars in China. I tried to read and understand that article and see the context of things. The other one is England and China, the Opium Wars 1839 to 1860. And then the other is the economic histories of opium trade. Okay, those 3 articles are very important, but also try to read the other ones, as well as the summary, the overview of this particular segment, which has 3 modules. There are 3 modules in week 3. Try to read and understand them, because I'm going to ask for specifics in your exam. I'm going to ask for specifics. I'm going to ask you, you know, what ports where the wars fought in. I'm going to ask you what specific things the officials complained about, what was the content of the treaties, and how do you interpret them. That's one question. who benefited, which countries benefited, and to what extent and in what form did they benefit, and so forth and so on. So I'm going to be specific in asking you questions like the exam. Very often students who try to answer these questions ad lib, quickly go on the internet and try to find answers. You will not. So because I'm going to ask you for critical thinking about them, I'm going to ask for interpretations, I'm going to ask for meanings. And so I'm surprised that you all don't know what indentured laborer is, or an indentured servant. The indentured servant is somebody who is going to provide service in order to pay off a debt, or who can work their way into freedom by working a certain number of years according to a contract. Okay, and indentured servants are usually, not people that, voluntarily. It's not that it never happens. Somebody who is very poor, like during the early days of migration from Europe to America, somebody could, approach a wealthy person and say, if you pay my way to America, I will work for you for 2 years, and after that, I am free. In which case, if the normal wage was $100 a day, then they will work for $20 a day for 3 years. And after that, they are free. Okay, so that's what an indentured servant is. If somebody owed money to somebody, let us say, John owes money to James. John is a young man. He owes money to James, and he's not able to pay. He's struggling with it. He can get Bill to pay off his creditor, and then Bill would not take him on a trip to America. And if you work for me for 5 years, then you are free. And all I'm going to do is make sure you have food, you have clothing, you have a place to sleep at night. And after 5 years, you work off your debt and you are free. That's, what an indentured servant is. And sometimes, I mean, the indenture is not entirely free, in the sense that it's not always based on a legitimate indebtedness. I mean, somebody could kidnap somebody and make them an indentured servant. But by the 17th century, 18th century Europe and England, such things were no longer, the normal thing. But so a prisoner of war, a war prisoner could also, instead of paying ransom, they don't have money for ransom, and they're a prisoner of war, and they could be indentured of. Okay, so that's what indenture is all about. All right. Having said that, so does anybody have any questions to ask me? All right. Not hearing any questions, hearing none. The office hour is over. So I wish everybody a nice evening.
Good evening, Professor.
All right.
Thank you, sir. You have a good night. Enjoy your weekend.
All right. Thank you.